4 webinars over the course of 2013, involving and led by ALNAP members who are working in various ways on the topic of urban response. So this is the first one. It's experimental, and I do hope that you will all bear with us if we have any technical glitches, because none of us have done this before. We're very being hosted in this and future webinars by our colleagues at ELRA, who are providing the technical support, and I'd like to thank them for that. So I'm delighted to welcome today Professor David Sanderson of Brooks University, who was the lead author of the ALNAP Lessons Paper Responding to Urban Disasters, which you can find on the ALNAP website. I read it when you can actually listen to David present it, which is going to do in a minute. So what we will conduct an hour, I suggest, is that we, in a minute, hand over to Lucy Kingsbury, who will just take care of some of the sticks and the technicalities, make sure that everyone's microphones and everyone is able to hear what's going on. We'll then speak for around 30 minutes, and we'll then have a discussion based around your questions and comments, with David and myself giving some thoughts, and hopefully with lots of input from the constituency who are taking part in today's webinar. So once again, welcome. Thank you very much, and we hope this will be an interesting hour. I'll hand over now, if I may, to you, Lucy, to just explain some of the technology.
Sure, Paul. So my name's Lucy Kingsbury. I'm the Humanitarian Innovation Fund Administrator, and as Paul said, I'll be helping out on any technical issues. Obviously, for the people who probably can't hear this, I've just put up how to configure your audio and written in the chat box. So one of this as well is that if you have any questions that you'd like to ask David or Paul during the presentation, if you could type them in the chat box, which should be on your right, and direct them to myself. And we'll collate all these at the end of the presentation, put them up on a whiteboard, and we will try and get around to all the questions, but obviously there may be a lot. So as I said before, if you have any audio issues, please direct them to me and I'll try and help you as best as possible. Thank you very much. I will now pass over to David, and we can start.
Well then, thank you, Lucy, very much, and I just want to say what a privilege to be able to be part of this. Explains what we're going to talk about is urban disaster and the ALNAP paper Responding to Urban Disasters. That was in fact the latest round, co-authored by myself with Paul and also with the help of Leah Campbell, and is next to the 2009 paper written by Ian O'Donnell and Christine Smart with Ben Engen. So we're really building on a lot of their work. But the world has changed an awful lot in the last 3 years with a huge number of new disasters. Excuse me for the presentation. Okay, we're here with that. Thank you. Where our learning curve is big, and we're first to say that this paper may well be updated in a year or 2 years' time. So this is version 2 of what will probably be a large number of versions, because our learning curve is, and unfortunately there are more disasters that are happening. In this one, we want to talk about 3 things. First, setting the scene a bit with some images and lessons, and then the rich discussion, where hopefully we'll scratch our heads and learn a little bit more from each other as much as anything. So, urban disasters. Urban disasters are becoming more frequent. There are more people on the planet. Cities are growing by something like 1 million people a week, almost an indigestible fact. And so more people in dangerous places. Add to that climate change existence, which are already upon us, and we have a combination where it's safe to say that there will almost certainly be more. But this is felt differently. Now, just from you, this happens to be Tropical Storm Thing, which struck Pondicherry on New Year's Eve of 2011, and it was the biggest tropical storm that year. That part of the world had killed 46 people, 9 of which were in the city and just around. This was the height of the storm on New Year's Eve, I think. However, this is some tourist areas. It's quite a touristy city. However, next day, to walk around, There was still stuff happening, but there were people walking, people were smiling, people were wandering, people were seeing things. The next day also, people were out vending things, the JCBs were out, and stuff was being cleared that have been absolutely covered by debris and trees. To go back later, it was as nothing had happened. He had pretty much, and I'm slightly polarizing it for the point of the conversation, had pretty much recovered. Why? Honduras is sophisticated, it's got good governance, it's well organized. To use that word resilience, perhaps it bounced back to where it was pretty clearly. That doesn't dismiss the people killed or the seriousness of the issue. The tsunami happened 11th of March 2011, a big, enormous event. The earthquake in the sea was one of the biggest ever recorded, and the devastation was huge with, 17,000 people killed, something like that. The good news, if there was any, was that it wasn't way more than that, because Japan is super prepared. However, it was a very, very big event. That lecture wasn't mine, but this one was. I was standing with this man on a little mound about 30, 40 feet high. This man, you can see in his face the destructive witness around him being from that part of the world, from that city. He's actually pointing to where we're standing, and that town no longer exists on the coast. The tsunami large, it destroyed all things around. Some things are very huge and exceptionally hard to prepare for, and in areas where there are dents, the devastation can be particularly strong. However, Japan is extraordinary in its resilience. Within a few months, these images are just a few months later. Community radio was set up by well-meaning people who used to live in Sendai, who had left and had come back. That whole thrust of civil society to want to respond, to want to be there, to want to help. And the top airport was opened within a matter of weeks. The airport was famously devastated, and many of you probably saw those images as I did on television as it happened. The Boston Center at Sendai, one of several, the 200 people who made it to that building survived. Many of those who tried to get there and didn't get it didn't survive. But the point saying is the level of preparedness in that society is strong. This is known among societies, and is relatively strong. Well, it's very strong. Okay. As we saw in Haiti in the quake of January 2010, already the poorest country in the Western world, the devastating events. At least 20,000 people almost certainly lost their lives, and to France, as rural areas too, but the towns, the big city was really, really devastated. Why? Because of weak governance, because of poverty, because of weak infrastructure being built, of relative incoherence in structures there. The picture is actually from the balcony of UN Habitat's office at the time, where you could look out and where you could see people trying to rebuild their lives in their neighborhoods, not being elsewhere. And that's certainly going to be one of our lessons that we have in the paper. The top right, huge rubble, and people trying to get around and to move in those very difficult places. The bottom picture, the building in the foreground fell down, and the one right next to it stayed up. Why? That shouldn't be the case when the building codes are the same. That just shouldn't happen. Britannia said it extremely clearly at the time that it's poverty that's at the core of this disaster, that underlying vulnerability. So we can set the scene in no more than a few images that are very quick, really, and move on to our paper. Oh, thank you, Paul. I was pressing the wrong button. Okay, so the main message. Okay, the main message is the work for many rural, for what for rural may not work so well for urban. That might sound rather obvious, but I think it's relatively safe to say that human aid and response has built a lot of its tools, approaches, understandings, thinkings from its rural experiences. Of course, that's absolutely fine. We start working in the field. But of course, working in the field when we're thinking about a dense neighborhood, and there is something, the mindset and the way of thinking we need to think about different. And I think a lot of the paper, a lot of the lessons that we try to find out by looking at 176 articles, trying to find the peer-reviewed stuff, trying to find the evidence, although that can be difficult at the time. Pretty much we need to change our assumptions and our tools and our approaches to be more relevant. It may be slightly bold to say, but it's really thinking about how we do this. So one of the subtexts of our paper is it's about that. cement the reason for that, not to dwell on this too much, but this is an extraordinary slide. 1950 and the left, 2050, we're pretty much bang in the middle there in 2013, just over the side. You see world population growth. Richer is the red line that's pretty flat. The blue is the one that's shooting up. Cities are growing huge. 9/10 of the new people on the planet will almost be certainly born in towns and cities. They have the countryside or the villages to return to. This is home. What do we do and how do we think? Okay, we are in an urban world. Complexity. These here could have been even 10 times more. We have gangs, mafia, competition, politics, squats, wealth, neighborhood, slums, land, skills, poverty, crime, illegal, legal. Really, really good of culture and commerce competition to the really, really bad. And the complexities that we in this sector, of course, are bound to think about if we want work to be significant. And we want that. So, into the lessons. These have been 38 lessons, 100 lessons, 4 lessons. 9 is not a magic number. It's not one that I'm aware of. And they happen to be 9. Okay. And what we'll do in this presentation was not to bore you to death with pages of text, but we tried to be slightly punchy with some of the statements, so headlines, your invitations to look at the paper, to get your feedback, and tell the next version is better. So these summary statements. Lesson 1 for us, clear boundaries for urban programs, but flexibility within those boundaries. And that means we need to have a sense of what we're doing and have clarity about the kind of work we're working in, because as we'll know, cities are immensely complex. We're sitting in central London looking out the window. It would be foolish to think about where we would even start to do things. So clarity of the kind of work that we're doing. Okay. So from this, the lesson that it might sound immediately counterintuitive and rather odd is that we won't need to know when to leave. We will never fix it. We will never be almost certain a place where it's returned to now. If Haiti could be as bad as it was beforehand, is the unfortunate phrase some of us heard while doing some work there. It's in place. So knowing when to leave, have a clarity there for surgical teams. We know when to withdraw. The other kinds of work. We avoid as much as we can the dependent scenario which pervades this kind of work. Okay, I'm going quickly on this. As I say, these are tasters, so please look at the paper. Focus on specific areas. They may be geographic areas, of course, or they may be sectoral areas. To be very clear to what we're focusing on, so don't lose that focus, because we will be pulled away, the famous concrete phrase, okay, because things were probably chronic already, if poverty is often equated with chronic poverty, always, but often. We know when to leave, we know what's clear about what we're doing. How exceptionally flexible. Things change, things are fast moving. You know what happens on a Tuesday afternoon might be quite different by Wednesday morning. There's not the stability, argued might be the case of hundreds of generations in rural areas, although things change there too. Cities are defined by rapid, constant change. So how do we work in that area? Thinking of our tools, our log frames, how flexible can they be in the kind of work that we're doing? Lesson 1. There's more in the paper. Local inclusion for lesson 2. Always work and coordinate with local authorities and communities. Okay, now we are the first, as no doubt you are, to say that's difficult because there are different agendas, different speeds. Unfortunately, too many city councils are overwhelmed and under-resourced. It can be very hard. Okay, NGOs are often based on the system of where there is no government. We get going and we do stuff. Argument is, and we believe the evidence is, we can't afford to do that. We need to focus very clearly on working with government. And that really is a bit of an aha with us. That always means working in partnership wherever we can. Sometimes we can't do that, of course. But when we do, we seek to work in partnership, of course, not only with government, but also with other agencies and NGOs, because it's that big and it's that complicated. The second important is, whose disaster is it? Haiti? Haiti is. Pakistan is Pakistan's. Now, we're in a globalized world. We get that. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, the disaster belongs to that country, because if it doesn't, we create dependency, we take it away, and then play to all some of the bad bits of aid in the past, which relates to us taking away ownership. And of course, that has to be a central tenet. I think that's around city councils, governments, authorities, and working through and with them. And there are plenty of very, very good examples from disasters in our paper about where it has happened around. Of course, the idea is to aim to strengthen governance. The picture in the top left there happens to be from Port-au-Prince. It's a boat voting was going on, the images 2 years ago when the current president was running for election there. It's about, however imperfect that might be around the world, is around supporting those structures because things get better. And clusters, local structures. Too often, of course, clusters might not always be the best they can be in terms of linking local structures, local languages. We know to be the case. We want that needs to improve, and also for urban areas, for towns and cities. I'm not sure if you're getting the big numbers that should be on the right-hand side there, but this is lesson 3 around urban complexity. And urban complexity requires appropriate assessment and targeting approaches. Now, this section of paper, we really wrestled with it. I think it runs to something like 5. And I think right at the top there, that this is good practice in rural as well as urban. And I should re-emphasize that for those of you who are thinking, well, it's rural too. Well, that's really fine. It's good practice too. And at the same time, we think these are good lessons for urban too. It would be counterintuitive if they weren't the same in some respects, but we think these are particularly urban also. For targeting, here's again, we come back to the idea they're big and they're complex. Our first statement is that it's blanket targeting. Do we have time to look at the nuances to find the most vulnerable? We, of course, will always ask about the most vulnerable. But given complexities, we think the learnings and the evidence is looking at blanket targeting as a kickoff. We're always looking at coordinating, and we unashamedly use the word coordination throughout this. It's always about working with others, sharing our assessments, our methodologies, the holy grail of those shared methodologies, share the findings. We really have no choice, arguably, but to do better and better, especially in towns and cities. Who wants to pinch the well-known phrase from Robert Chambers' work, particularly in rural areas, derived in the mid-1990s, which are what, of course, the reality that counts is a 7-year-old girl living in a squatter settlement, an 84-year-old man living in a middle-income neighborhood. And of course, any assessments are about listening and finding the voices of those people and listed realities. So our point there really is to talk about putting people first and listening and getting a sense. And I think we tell the story here that a disabled man in a house might be perceived to be vulnerable to an outside community, to an outside aid organization, but actually if he has a wealthy son sending remittances, that's a different story. We need to learn and to listen, and always, I think we will accept this, get better at our assessment approaches. The priority, this is interesting, and this again might sound slightly counterintuitive, but there is a growing phenomenon of class people living in cheaply built buildings that are high-rise that collapse in an earthquake. And we saw that in Ahmedabad, in the Gujarat earthquake, and elsewhere. Poor buildings for middle-class people. And so the equation is almost always around vulnerability and poverty. However, that's not always the case. So you need to think about that. Also, what does that mean for aid agencies to be working with people who, to speak, may be strong in other kinds of assets and be able to recover quicker than others? That ought to be part of our radar and how we think about that, given the density and mix of super wealth against super poverty in areas that are hit by the same size phenomenon. This is part of our world now. It may be that, of course, there are pockets of poverty, vulnerability. There may be dispersed groups of people, and we read a couple of times here and also in the protection section around people who are hidden in society, people who have gone on another country, people on the run, internally displaced people who don't want to be known, or political refugees in some way. People specifically want to be hidden in urban areas. We need to on our radar. What we do about that is then another issue, but to be on our radar is the least we can do. They may be in different pockets of the city. So it's of a challenge of having specific geographical areas, but also social, perhaps, disbursements that are part of our new world when it comes to urban thinking. And where are the rural-urban links? We've unashamedly been very bold in being very focused on urban, of course, to be consistent of rural-urban links and of markets and how people trade and move and shift and people move out of cities and in and out. So that's the radar as part of our story. Okay. So still the same lesson. To use urban-oriented minimum standards, and of course standards are vital. An awful lot are based on rural assumptions, absolutely fine. We just need to be aware that for urban things that might be very different. Maybe there's space standards or distance of water or all the other assumptions about how and what we think. And of course, many standards are aware and have developed or are developing urban-oriented standards. So we're seeing that progress even as we speak. Our later section on newer technologies is exciting. Even the who wrote it, it was probably out of date because things are shifting so quickly. But the use of SMS to have 2G phones, 4G phones, in 3-4 years' time will be dirt cheap. It's a relatively safe assumption that they will be ubiquitous. They already are, of course, but also when we're at demographics of guys having phones of younger and the rest. But things are changing so quickly, but the ability to use SMS for crowdsourcing, for tracking, for tracing has already been well enough and is well there, and it's a real game changer, rural and also for urban areas, and we write quite a bit about that really. Market different cities, thinking about markets, there may be assumptions about markets and rural areas, and areas around buying urban goods, and there's a difference there in urban goods which might be different to rural, so we think in those terms. And then this point a moment ago about the hidden people within our urban areas. Okay, lesson number 4. We almost want to put a great big exclamation mark there. We knew that in urban areas is important. That gives amazingly exciting opportunities. The Learning Partnership, of course, has been at the forefront for thinking about these things, and we drew an awful bit of stuff and some really excellent reports from there, as well as others. Cash. What great opportunities when you send cash transfers, exceptionally low transaction costs in areas to people. There's a lot of excitement about how we get better at that. We're not saying magic bullet or the world's now perfect, but we're saying the opportunities are great. It's a bit of a no-brainer around some of those things. Some of the things we picked up from our look at the evidence from this, the cash transfers can meet households' needs where markets work, and we add that important caveat about markets working being re-established. Cash transfers, get money to people. We saw that more recently, really, in the Pakistan floods. We refer that less in our paper, but there's an awful lot of learning around that, around cash-loaded credit cards. Lessons out there on this. For cash can be better than cash for work. We found some quite strong statements that we really think there's an important way to go. The image in the top left is Oxfam Quebec Cash for Work program. It's an NGO, of course, of people doing some work in Port-au-Prince. And the critique around cash for work programming, not just there but elsewhere, is often it's low quality work, it's not well monitored, it's often for able-bodied people, a whole series of issues there and complexities. To boil that down, to look at some of the findings, and finding that transfers may well work better. And some findings to that from Grupo AD, from François Grunwald and others have really sought to find some of the findings relating to those areas. This means cash is spent where it's needed. We come back to the assessments, getting those good, that we can really target our cash and use that well when assessments are tied into cash, and we have a section on that. Okay, really important to us. Lesson 5, and this is an important statement, we think. It is an investment. To summarize the story a little bit, to give a little bit of a, sort of an extreme here, the just aid, immediate lives and livelihoods, the wish for relief, obviously it's about relief and lives and livelihoods, but there's a duty to go beyond that, that it's both and, it's not either or. And if it's a city and it's commerce and cash and culture and competition and all these issues that urban areas embody, we must see aid as investments. And that ties into resilience, DRR, all the agendas we all subscribe to. We do that. Some of the ethics we found in some of the research and some of the evaluations, work with local markets and the private sectors to get good at, unashamedly embrace that. That doesn't mean naive to market forces and capitalism, all those things that some of us might find, frankly, a bit difficult, but I need to play those to our advantage. So it is around using market vendors straight after a big disaster and paying them to provide food, and we found examples from that from various disasters. That's something we should think about. We work with the markets. Are arguing is a pretty central bit of our story. But very obviously buy things where you can. Again, to polarize slightly, an assumption for a logistical point of view, things in, obviously if needed, but can you buy it? Can you source it locally? Now, we're not, that doesn't already happen, but we're saying really build on that and really put that to the front of some of our thinking. It's a city. It's where culture and stuff is and where things are. It's not all idle of something else. It's actually where stuff goes on. And we find that. I go to buy things too often. Excuse the flippancy. But the assumption we can get things where they are. Okay? Urban livelihoods reliance on local markets. I think we've made that point around markets. Think of public-private development. We give an example from Booge, where governments linked up with different private and public providers to provide things. And our point there is there are different combinations of partnerships which might create opportunities for us to think cleverly. This is lesson number 6, and this is a big and this is a complex one, and I don't know if it's crucial, but it's certainly one that's certainly big right now. And our summary of a lot of stuff is to adopt an urban approach. We see that as an opportunity. That's not being naive to the complexities of land and of tenure, of things that have really halted an awful lot of recovery program, a lot of urban places, all the place. But it was like that before disaster. It was already fiendishly complicated. Part of the story here is we don't think we can fix it in a short term with a lot of money in a very complex place. Now that does present opportunities, of course, of big investments in places where things have happened, and to use the phrase build better, something like that. But it's a powerful phrase to have an assumption we can do good things. I really want to make the point. It was fiendishly complex beforehand, and that's an important thing to know. Camps and shelter. Okay, at the edges relates to one of our findings about World Bank advice. Almost every policy you can see, which for a disaster, if you can possibly do so, avoid relocating communities elsewhere. Your policy of safe relocation, safe rebuilding, where it is safe to do so, and that's important too. After the Mexico earthquake, look to rebuild your neighborhoods. This is your neighborhood, for better or for worse. Again, that's not naive to seeing complexity and the 950 million plus people living in squats and informal settlements. We found it very hard to find good learn about just what you do in a squatter camp after a disaster. That complex one, maybe that's next on the big radar, and there's some very good people working on it right now. What exactly do we do to that? That's really hard. Learning is don't relocate. And of course, for well-meaning reasons, people do relocate communities. All the lessons are, please avoid that if you can. You spread the city, you spread the carbon footprint, it's not green. Good earning, good morphology is a indentification. It's around those things. Long-term, not transitional, and we thought long and hard about this. The big many people know is around transitional shelter. Interim shelter designed to last 3 to 5 years that can be rebuilt and reused. I'd say the transitional shelter approach is more about its host families and its money and an awful lot of clever approaches. And all Asians, however, have picked up the one thing of building, and on the top left demonstrates very often, not always, single story, often standalone timber buildings to last 3 to 5 years. That might suck up 20% of an aid budget. That's a good idea. That's not an urban form. That can sit well, literally, but also figuratively when it comes to investing in the city. That's not a wise investment. And it looks an awful lot of SCAT, IFRC's research and really interesting stuff relating to that. That's a complex area, but that's one area we can learn a lot on. Land, of course it is. LP, housing, land, property rights, an awful lot of this stuff. A lot of good thinking IFRC is working on it right now around regulatory barriers. We tap it out a little bit. It's a fast-moving subject. Opportunities. A colleague from CARE who often talks about working vertically and thinking about space, not land, might provide us with really interesting thinking there. The point we want to make is cities are enriching creativity, care atmosphere. We can be clever about how we address these issues and really get it right. And just think about that. Okay, squatters. We found it very hard to find good examples about how we do that, but we think it opens up opportunities around renting. Still, expertise for building, often like in many sectors, people who are not sufficiently expert however may be well-meaning, involved. That's not good enough, frankly. We need to be professional about how we spend lots of money and be serious about that. To urban forms of living. Okay, that's rents, sub-rentals, all kinds of different things. And we need to be clever about that. The assumption people own the land and we build a shelter, that doesn't do that. That's not an urban form. Okay, on. Lesson 7 is urbanized sectoral interventions. This is a big section, and this is where our 9 lessons could have been 14. Under that, we have 5 sectors. There could have been more. We chose 5, and we tried to be quite hard-edged with our. We're going to go through them in great detail because that will double the length of our time. But these are invites to look. The first one is to rubble, debris, and solid waste. Big and serious, and this stymies a lot of people working in a lot of urban disaster. What do you do with the rubble? Do you end up in the drains? Do you put it in the sea? Do you compact it and build and put it into the soil? That's dangerous because in 10 years' time, your buildings might slip as it gets badly compacted. Okay, so lots of issues there. Also, toxic debris. So, section on that. We know the next version of this paper that will be bigger and longer. Water and hygiene, big complex area, and we really drew an awful lot of Oxfam GB's work as well as others, and we're grateful to Andy Bastable for really thinking that through with us, and also for Luff and their insights on these areas. Use of poo bags, about where you cite, I just have it in Paul, I think it was in favor, as I look at you now. About do you do bores, how do you tap into existing infrastructure? One of Andy's observations is know not to do. Do you end up rebuilding an infrastructure system for a city? Just imagine that. Okay, so knowing when to leave and what to do and how to be good at that. Food into much is actually buy it. And I'm looking at Paul here, WFP's thinking, FAO, at least WFP, relates to, please correct me if I'm wrong, it's in the paper, relates really, we're looking to buy stuff around using transfers for foods. I'm very grateful for Oxfam GB for an awful lot of thinking, but it relates to that, and Laura Phelps in particular. To health, there's quite a lot in that from some evidence for some papers we picked up. I'm a health person, but to learn that it's considered not good practice to take mass burials because bodies do carry the disease that maybe many people think they did. I certainly thought they did. All use of identification, and also saying goodbye to loved ones, but also bearing that at the same time with the knowledge that there's a lot of bodies to do with that. Big complex area. Also to direct your emergency response team to the specific hazard. So if it's earthquake, it's crush injuries, and it's specific kinds of damage and traumas that we need to look at, especially in the response. But that was a big topic, and it's a big and growing topic for all the right reasons, because it's a big issue around vulnerability, especially of girls and of women, and in camps and in poorly lit places, and sexual abuse and sexual attacks. And we need to be better at that and cognizant in the informal camps that arrive, and also the formalized ones, and be very, very clever and thoughtful about how we actually think about protection issues. And this has certainly been a very fast-growing the last few years. Sectors, this relates to lesson 8, and this was a brand new one for us, around better communication, using existing media to improve information gathering and accountability. Oh my, how quick this is happening. The top left is Haiti app. It could have been, there are several, it's not the only one on the market, there are other market brands available, but Haiti is quite a big one about promoting transparency. Frontline SNS, it's exciting where we can use crowdsourcing and mapping and Google Maps, and even only 6-7 years ago, getting hard maps, a bit of a struggle now. It's super quick and exciting. It's not perfect, it's not a magic bullet, but our section and our paper talks an awful lot around the new ideas around using methods of runners. That's community radio, a great stalwart. The image from Sendai, that has a broadcast of something like a couple of kilometers, but that really became a mainstay for that community in an advanced society as Japan. So it's super powerful. Mobile phones, I think we've touched on that. And mapping, the efficiency of using that so we can really target our assessments. At the same time, however, being aware that there's ability to be abused and to be misused, and there's misinformation, we don't assume it's all perfect and pure on talks to that. coming to the final on urban resilience, an important topic that occupies an awful lot of us, as we know. But this is Ava's investment again. Our efforts need to be built by relief and recovery actions to avoid wasted investment. We don't want to waste our investments. If you're a super poor place and a lot of money comes very quickly, we don't want to waste that. And I think, our findings are that we need to be much better at thinking about those things. Because we know for a lot of these places, the disaster comes back. And we're part of the story about not making that happen and being part of that. So issues are in line with governmental plans. Okay, framework for action there, and of course what's coming post-yoga, which is occupying quite a lot of us at the moment, trying to tie into that. So being with government plans, this comes back to whose disaster is it? Actually, frameworks, that might be a role for agencies and others to play. Again, being naive to the fact that that's not immensely complicated, but we need to engage in that if we're thinking about the long-term inclusive urban planning. Some examples of agencies thinking long-term in the building of communities with good people in the center of that. There are some really good examples we draw on in our paper related to that. Unfortunately, get that. But only slightly, for moving very quickly about some of the headlines. There are adverts, please mention to really look at our paper to test, how version 3 is stronger. And I think a moment where we're going to take some questions and some discussion.
Indeed. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, everybody. It's as you can see, it's a lot in the paper, and David did a remarkable job there, I think, in covering the key headers. It would be nice now to dive down into some areas which are of interest to those of you who are listening. Before we do so, I just wanted to mention that we've already had offers of research, some research on case studies around renters and squatters, and that might be a good opportunity to just put in a quick plug for those of you who are aware of it for the portal. If you Google, Francie will speak of this a little bit later, but ALNAP and UN Habitat have jointly established a portal where we're trying to collate all the research and knowledge around urban response. Very much for the humanitarian community, so we'd strongly urge anyone who does have new research and new thinking to put that onto the portal. We'll give you some details about how to do that later. Let's go over to some of the comments that we had. Maybe we could start, David, with George Devendorf's question here. You mentioned earlier on this challenge about should I stay or should I go? The advice on trying to rebuild in place rather than relocating population centres onto margins of towns. And George is asking, you had whether the evidence, whether the literature support the key factors that you would take into account when making that decision. So if it's easy to reduce this to, I'm going to ask you to do it anyway, easy or not, whether it's possible to reduce this to the sort of what the three things, the three issues that you might really want to bear in mind when you're making that decision, David.
No, thank you, George, for that. Okay, the first thing is, there are magic bullets. There's no simple here, of course, but the World Urban Reconstruction Guidelines are very clear. Do not relocate people unless you really have to. In the cases where you do have to, climbing the sea level rises, and we're going to be relocating people. So there are those things. At the same time, after the earthquake in Skopje in the early 1960s in Macedonia, as it is now, I think it was then, it probably was, very quickly in a matter of hours or days, the military people there in charge said, we will rebuild over there for all the right intents, temporary camps. Those they then become permanent. Temporary often has the habit of becoming permanent, and there are planners and architects and designers and people who spend lifetimes considering good urban form and morphology and the things talked about identification and compact cities, and to be very careful to very quickly redesign a city super fast. Now, I mean, there are different views around Camp Karai in Haiti and Timber-Isa. There's a Los Angeles, New York Times review, big article from last summer, a revisit to Camp Karai. And it's all of us hope it's going to be good and it's going to build and it's going to vibrant and rest. Right now, it's possibly anything but that. However, people are very clever at establishing themselves when there's not much else to do. We have to be really, really careful about putting people somewhere else. Now, the complexity comes if you're living in a dense squat or living in a slum that was 8 stories high and there were 40 families in there, or possibly 200 families. What is that you're going to do now? Those big complications, and that's the big challenge upon us. How do we work dense urban neighborhoods where there are vague land? So I think it's out. But currently, the best advice we could find is about relocate people far away, keep them where they can, if possible, neighborhoods, if it's safe to do so, as you and Habitat say.
Just as a rider to that, can I ask, could you, from the evidence, do we have any situations in which you would not do that? Are there red lines where that general advice would not apply?
Well, it's not safe to do so. I think that's a genuine issue. You wouldn't rebuild in a place on a steep that's going to fall over again, although people will almost certainly do that. Yeah, the difference is that coastal sea level rises or where floods happen and we can't afford to build the flood retaining walls. So there will be cases where we need to shift, and this is the phenomenon that's gone forever, but we're naming it and trying to understand it now. But this does tie into the bigger picture of what we do around post-disaster housing, when we have a lot of people in tents who might be getting very cold, taking the buffer about or something. What are we going to do to build temporary housing? The agency standing committee says we need to be careful about the ethical dimensions of rebuilding temporary, investing so much money in a temporary solution. That word ethical is a potent word, and quote that, and that's an innovation for us to better at what we do.
Thank you. We've some great questions coming in. I'm sure we're not going to have time to address them all. I think this speaks here of the experience that we had both at the ALNAP meeting on urban in NI last January, and also in writing the paper, that there are obviously far more questions out there than there are answers. This is an area, I think, where in trying to put the urban response area and trying to put together evidence, we also became aware of the many gaps in evidence that there are, and it's actually only through experience and true response that those gaps will be met. I'd like to respond to a question here from Chris Hett. Thank you for that, Chris. Chris too, working with local authorities, and he's saying, first of all, working two questions here. First of all, does working with local authorities not mean corresponding to the time of incident after disaster and the type of disaster? If I understand this correctly, Chris, that working with local authorities in the immediate response phase, in the first sort of 72 hours, in Haiti, for example, there might not be any authorities readily available or visible to work with. So, respond to that. And also, you asked, Chris, what's the reference to, we have mentioned the issue of corruption in local authorities, and you're quite right, we haven't. So, you're not the first person to bring this up in relation to the paper. And so I thought if I could just spin a couple of thoughts around that from our reading and what the ALNAP members seem to be. It is true, on the first point, it's certainly true that it can be difficult to locate the local authorities in the first 72 hours. Although it's also true that generally, if one looks at Haiti and if one looks at the potential for, God forbid, somewhere like a Nepal earthquake, a Kathmandu earthquake, it's not particularly likely that international response will be largely on the ground in the first 72 hours anyway. The first 72 hours of response tend to be dominated by the local population, not international response. And I think that's probably worth bearing in mind. By the time that the international community has arrived, where the government will often have been ahead of the game, although not always, but in many cases will be ahead of the game in terms of response. It's their question of how one articulates with the responses that are already there. Said that, however, the corruption and general issue issue of the legitimacy of government, particularly in conflicted areas, is where in some cases you will have effectively civil wars going on in cities as well as natural disasters, is an issue. And I clarify that we're not saying do what the government says. None of the work about what's been effective contravenes humanitarian principles of neutrality and independence. Rather, examples of organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, for example, raising that a government is in place. And finding ways to work in a collaborative way while maintaining the principles. For example, not following government, not following government protocols, not following the way that the government structures things can lead to situations where, for example, you have 20 different medical organizations, all of whom are medical records are in different formats and do not include the same information. And there is no central repository, and this happened in Haiti, of those records, and they're lost. And so continuity of treatment for medical staff, for medical victims, becomes impossible. And that has massive implications for those large numbers of victims. The government-endorsed medical protocol on something like cause keeping necessarily to follow the government line in all areas, but it is to articulate with a mechanism, which is the only mechanism that works, and the alternatives to that is dangerous. There are, of course, examples of that in things about location and housing, that if cities go in and end is in the beginning with shelter, cities go in and set up whole new urban areas, new urban forms, without any reference to government plans, that can have humanitarian and huge financial implications. So this how to work with local government, we don't have all the answers, but what the literature is, one needs to attempt to do it. Not the same as doing everything that that government would want to happen, but it's certainly in technical areas where structures and plans exist. It's following those to the degree that they do not contravene humanitarian principles. And in most cases, those technical areas do not contravene humanitarian principles. That's clear. It's a very complex and I think important. It would be interesting to hear what people think about that.
I would just add to that the situation about how our relief and response shifting to recovery can sometimes undermine the market. And an example of that, and I think we talk a little bit about this, relates to healthcare and medical response. Existing medical services are fee-paying, nurses and doctors earn money through being paid. And for all reasons, in relief recovery, we have medical teams for the right reasons. The risk is undermining existing services. Now, there's no who's not aware of that. I think it'd be nice to see people are. But how we plug into those existing markets and the existing economics and the way people earn lives and livelihoods, I should say, I think is exceptionally important. I think we just need to be aware of that and to do that.
Thank you. I want questions are coming in about the issue of coordination, and maybe I'll bring some of these out and see what we from the literature that speaks to these. So from Iraq, Veronica Chenikova, Veronica, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, is talking about the coordination problems and problems with management of coordinating Syrian refugees. And basically talking about how do you coordinate when you have these very, very large numbers of agencies, lots of agencies, NGOs, government entities who are not necessarily part of the international system, so we don't know very well even who they are, and local community organizations and civil society organizations. And it's very hard for these different kind of organizations to work together. And so Veronica's talking about issues, for example of double distribution, where one group is seeing the same thing twice and the group next door is getting nothing at all. Do you have any experience on that? Similarly, around Claudia Schneider is asking decluttering with local structures, but how do the clusters work with local structures? How do they coordinate where the local structures are weak and not effective? So this links the coordination issue to the local authority issue. So several issues have come up around this, but coordination, what doesn't work, I think. I think there are plenty, and Haiti has been used, but it's not by any means the only case of picking up and not using the local language and holding coordination meetings in places which are behind barbed wire, where local people are not able to come in, where the lens is not informed. We have many examples of this. Do you know anything about what does work yet, David? And no okay answer as well.
Well, you know, I mean, thank you for that. And also, Claudia, I don't think I'm going to say, and we're going to say much you don't already know. I'm sorry to say that. It's immensely big. It's immensely complicated. We know the principle is the disaster belongs to the country, and we need to help what is often overwhelmed and resourced, sometimes ranging from the completely incompetent and corrupt to the very impressive and trying but struggling people in the public sector all around the world. And our role has to be to support that. And I think we all know that. It would be pretty rare not to anybody who doesn't think that that's important and the fundamental principle of governance. And the reality might be that that's ethos cyto. Now, nobody would disagree the humanitarian imperative comes first. And at the same time, that imperative that comes first needs balance with the long-term investments of what we're doing. I'm not sitting comfortably in London suggesting that that's a simple trick to pull off, but we have to have those two things equally in mind in order to difference about what we do if we're thinking about long-term and not continue to erode existing structures. And as we all know, is the damage and the danger sitting with, you know, have our stories, and this is anecdote, but it's illustrative, sitting around after the Pakistan earthquake in Muzaffarabad, and he's the head of a big NGO. Of course, the cluster meetings are in English, not in Urdu. And there, he's sitting there. This is his city. He was born, he was raised, he heads up the NGO. Sponsored by an awful lot of people. We're grateful for that, and we're sitting on the edge, and we don't like, we feel we're part of that city. And the reports that speak to that, we don't feel we're part of our city anymore. And there's a thinker from Haiti also. And I think we see that so often, we need to understand and get better at it. So for all the right reasons, we want to move as quickly as we can and to do the things that we do. Nobody would argue that's wrong. But touching on stuff that's generational and maybe complex and touches on centuries, and things move slowly all over the place and in difficult places. What do we think we can do, the speed we can? And I think that comes back to the difficult decisions, knowing what to touch, when to leave, what to do. We can't fix it, we need to be flexible. And I'm sitting here thinking, goodness, this sounds a bit trite, but I think these are the principles which underpin, and we need to remind ourselves about what we can do if we're going to get right. Now, I do think it's a bit of a shift about what's achievable. We don't turn up in chronically poor places and think we're going to fix it now. We can't. I mean, look, we only could. We can't. It's not a village where it's okay now, or whatever it may be. It's profound different. So we need to be clever. And if the meeting takes twice as long because actually the language, maybe that's okay, actually. That's the point. And that's difficult, right? That's difficult. And I sit there with frustration too. But it's difficult. But I think we need to think differently. So that's my response.
Could I add, Paul, a couple of thoughts to that as well, David? A couple of sort of good practices in addition which come through. These are more odd in the briefs. These are more good ideas than good practices, I think. But one is, and they're both fairly obvious, the importance of mapping actors, particularly actors who exist on the ground, particularly government departments and civil society, in advance. This is into conversations about the importance of DR and so on, but the urban environment, we know where the cities that are on fault lines are, for example. We know where there are places where people have built on tidal plains or coastal plains. It's not rocket science to work out whether there are going to be large urban emergencies. It's only problematic to know when. In these places like, we've spoken about Kathmandu already, but places like Kathmandu, know who is in the game, and also knowing the existing protocols and ways of working which exist so as not to reinvent the wheel is potentially a very small invention which can have huge coordination benefits when the disaster happens. The second that comes out of a lot of the work, particularly around the clusters, is very clear about the differentiation between coordination and decision making on one hand and information sharing on the other. These groups are good for information sharing, but very bad for coordination and decision making. And so the baby clusters that we used in Haiti, for example, are essentially a way of separating out those two functions so that both can occur. Similarly, using technology, and we've touched on this already, mapping software, for example, to share information quickly and painlessly so people don't have to sit through hours of presentations in a meeting when they could actually be working on this spot. So there are a few things that can be done. And the more examples of that you have and are able to share through the Urban Portal, the better. On the issue of coordination, I go to Nicolas' question here. Even with the best coordination, actors have different budgets, competencies, and rhythms. Should there be one actor for one activity or sector, at least leading and making decisions with the global picture? My personal response from reading is that Nicolas, and I'm sure many people may disagree, is yes, there should be one actor. Actor should, in most cases, there is a functioning ministry, be the ministry, because they're the people who have got the background, should ideally be supported by the agency of that sectoral cluster where appropriate. That kind of looks good on paper. I really. So another question. I'm sorry, we're just working with the technology here. Today at ECB is asking about behavioural competencies and mentioning the CBHA behavioural competency framework. Does it be revised taking into account specific behaviours that are necessary to successfully deliver urban responses? Or responses, good responses, regardless of where they take place? Fascinating question. Here we go. Hello.
Okay, fantastic question, David. Working in humanitarian aid have come from a rural background with rural tools. I certainly did, and a lot of people have. And the exciting challenge now is, in addition to that, to think with an urban mindset, and may well be our overlaps are the same, and in time it might be profoundly different. So there's an opportunity, again, I come back to urban as the most wonderful opportunity to think about our approach to competence is absolutely. Do we approach the city from a logistics point of view, if you like, to paint a picture here? It's around straight roads of water and supplies, or do we come from a morphological point of view when we think about high rises and densities and windy streets and stuff like that? What are the assumptions behind that? I basically enjoy living in a logistically perfect camp. I would rather live in a neighborhood actually that's being rebuilt or whatever it might be. So great opportunities. In fact, I think to at the very least have that specific conversation with our urban hats and think with our urban hats.
Hi. Hello. Really sorry about this background noise. Not quite sure what that is. Paul?
Hello. Sorry, for some reason
Acted both calls. He seems to be on twice now. Bear with us a second. Oh wow. Okay. I think we may have to end it there actually, because the background noise is not nice. I'll just pass over to Francesca from ALNAP, and we can about something else. Sorry about that, everybody.
Comments officer here at ALNAP. Thank you very much for participating. We're so astonished that close to 100 people have actually listened in, and a lot of you have posted questions. So I just wanted to point to you that, like Lucy said already, this will be recording of this webinar will be available on the ALNAP website and also on our Urban Humanitarian Response portal. And if your question hasn't been answered, there's the opportunity to email either David or Paul separately. Or if you wanted to have people participating in the discussion, you could also post your question or observations on our discussion forum called Humanitarian Response in Urban Crisis. And the link to that is written whiteboards that you should see, but Lucy is working on that. And finally, I wanted to just say that I've planned another next webinar for Thursday, the 14th of March, same time, and we are delighted to hear a presentation by Jean-Christophe Adrian. He's an ex-director of the UN Habitat Haiti and currently director of the Liaison Office for European Institutions at UN Habitat. And he will be speaking about strengthening urban response and system-wide elements, focusing on operational experiences. And I think he will bring his experience from Haiti. Looking forward to that, and you will shortly receive more information and an invitation as well. So thank you for listening and for contributing. And I think I will close this then. Have a good day. Take care.
I'm just going to put that information up on the whiteboard there so you can take it down. Again, thank you for attending.